Hey guys, Nintendrew here. Nintendo surprised us this past week with a direct presentation focused on the upcoming Nintendo Museum in Kyoto. And whether you've seen it already or have yet to check it out, in this video we're going to recap all the major exhibits that they showed off, and we're also going to take a look at some pretty well hidden details you might have missed. So, let's get to it. Alright, so starting off right at the beginning, Miyamoto introduces us to the Nintendo Museum and gives a bit of a history lesson about the building. This location was once the factory that Nintendo used to produce Hanafuda and other playing cards, so it's super cool to see it come full circle and be used as the venue for the museum. We also get a quick glimpse here of the outside courtyard. Next up, Miyamoto brings us to the second floor, which has dedicated displays for various Nintendo consoles and handhelds throughout the years, with giant controller models suspended above to represent them. But what you might not have noticed is, just to the left of the GameCube controller, we can see part of a Virtual Boy controller in the background. It's good to see that with the museum, Nintendo didn't overlook the most important chapter of their history. Moving on to a closer look at the Famicom and NES section, the first thing that caught my eye was this pie chart on the wall. At first I thought it might be a representation of genres or something, but I squinted at it long enough to decipher that these are regional sales figures for Japan, the Americas, and Europe and other regions. And since these charts can be seen across the displays on the second floor, it's safe to assume that you'll be able to find regional sales data for each system represented. Another fun detail I noticed here in the NES exhibit is related to the release dates shown for each title. Interestingly enough, many of them seem to be missing the specific day, or in some cases even the month of release. This is because even Nintendo doesn't know exactly when some of the NES launch window titles were first sold. For example, one of my favorite tidbits of Nintendo trivia is that nobody knows the exact day that Super Mario Bros. Released in the US, which is nuts. You would think that somebody would have kept track of these things, but game releases just weren't as big of a thing back then. And of course, this was a time well before the widespread adoption of the internet, so some of those launch dates are pretty much lost to time. One more thing to note here, it's clear that these exhibits are still in progress because there are some empty spaces on the shelves that have those little date labels, but no box or cartridge, so I'd imagine the museum will get some more pieces in as we get closer to the grand opening and beyond. Miyamoto mentions here that, quote, games that Nintendo published are on display, so it sounds like no third-party representation, at least for now, which kinda makes sense. Next up, we get a peek at a timeline of motion-based toys and games that Nintendo has produced throughout the decades. It's interesting to see them contextualize games like Wii Fit and Ring Fit Adventure as an extension of some of the first toys that they ever brought to market. Then we get a look at a display showing the evolution of the question mark block throughout the Mario series. And one little detail here that's kind of fun, I guess I've never really thought about it, but Super Mario Bros. 2 is the only mainline Mario game that doesn't have some sort of item block, so they chose to represent it here on the timeline with a blank square. And finally, the last part of the second floor that we get to see is this amazing display of classic Nintendo products throughout the years before they broke into the home console market. This whole shot is full of fascinating gadgets and board games. Honestly, this section could warrant a video on its own, but what really caught my eye were the retro Nintendo logos depicted on the back wall. There's a section for what I assume is the early to mid 1900s, the 80s, the 90s, and beyond. Now, this will probably out me as a Giga nerd, but I also noticed in the reflection of the glass right above Miyamoto's head, there's a Game & Watch logo, so presumably the Game & Watch family is on display on the opposite side. And finally, above the case, they've set up a few screens to show what looks like TV commercials of the era for the products on display. Pretty cool? Next up in the Direct, Miyamoto explains that the first floor of the museum is dedicated to 8 interactive experiences, each based on a chapter of Nintendo's history, and that 3 of them will be showcased in this presentation, the first of which is the Ultra Machine. This is an indoor pitching machine Nintendo produced starting in the 60s, but the museum version seems to benefit from some modern amenities. Each of the batting cages is decorated to look like an authentic Japanese home from the era, and as you hit these ping-pong balls back at the wall, a sensor detects where the ball hits and will trigger objects in the environment to react. Then it looks like the floor is sloped such that the balls fall back behind the machine through a gap in the wall to be thrown again. A fun detail I noticed during the Direct is that the background music for this experience seems to be pulled from the minigames from Ocarina of Time. Take a listen.
では早速打ってみましょう。あ、惜しい。
Then we're taken to a laser clay-inspired gallery shooter game where you use repurposed NES zappers and super scopes to take down Mario enemies. And honestly, this exhibit led to some of the most delightful footage of the Direct.
さあ、いっぱい出てきました。どんどん打って。よし。 どうでしょうね、結果は。良かったみたいですよ。次へ行きましょう。
Alright, finally we've made it to what was objectively the highlight of the entire presentation. Big controllers!
そうです。コントローラーが超巨大です。
Miyamoto and a staff member showcased what it's like to play Super Mario Bros. Together on a massive Famicom controller. But that's not the only system on display.
やりました。
In the next shot, to the left of Miyamoto, we can see a Nintendo 64 controller. To the right, there are some employees using giant Wii remotes. In the back are some more staffers using Super Famicom controllers to play what looks like A Link to the Past and Super Mario Kart. And between those groups are a couple more Nintendo reps using a massive Wii balance board. Now you might be asking, what about the GameCube? Where's my giant GameCube controller? Well, Miyamoto specifically said we'll be able to play Famicom, Super Famicom, N64, and Wii games, and he usually picks his words carefully, so I'm guessing the GameCube fans will have to wait to fulfill their gargantuan controller dreams. At this point, the Direct is wrapping up, but before the end, we do get a brief glimpse at an optional DIY workshop where you can learn how to play Hanafuda and create your own Hanafuda cards, which looks super cool. And finally, the grand opening is announced for October 2nd. And Miyamoto suggests that viewers check out the museum website for more details, which of course is exactly what I did. And I found that the website has information on all 8 of the interactive exhibits on display, so let's quickly go over those. First is Shiguruden, in which visitors use a smartphone to read poem fragments displayed on the floor. Points are awarded based on how fast you're able to find and collect cards that match to complete each poem. There was a brief segment of the Direct where we could see employees testing this experience. We saw the Zapper and Super Scope experience and the Ultra Machine, so next is the Ultra Hand, an exhibit dedicated to another one of Nintendo's pre-video game inventions. In this experience, you'll control an extending gripper arm to grab balls as they move across a horizontal lane and guide them into the pipes below. Next is the Love Tester, which apparently allows you and a partner to hold hands and take on various tests to raise your, quote, love level. It's unclear exactly what that entails, but I'm sure it'll be an interesting set of minigames. Then we've got the Game & Watch experience, which looks to be an iToy-style game where you control the on-screen characters with your silhouette. And you'll be able to play 2 different classic Game & Watch games this way, Ball and Manhole. And finally, the last interactive exhibit we have yet to cover is called Nintendo Classics, and this sounds kinda like a free-play console room at a game convention, with a focus on titles from the Nintendo 64 era and prior. Apparently those titles will line up with the games currently available on Nintendo Switch Online, so if you've already got a subscription, it might not be the most exciting thing, but a nice addition nonetheless. Another thing I found on the website is a complete floor map so you can see the general layout of the museum and get an idea for how much space they're working with. And the last thing I want to highlight here is, although you do have to enter a raffle to get the chance to purchase tickets, if you manage to get them, the tickets themselves are super cheap. An adult ticket is listed for 3,300 yen, including tax, which is about $23 US today, and that is the most expensive ticket available. I don't know about you guys, but I expected them to be much more pricey. So that'll be good news for locals and tourists alike looking for a cheap and fun afternoon in Kyoto. Alright guys, I think that's it for today, but make sure to let me know in the comments down below what your favorite part of the museum was and what you're most looking forward to. I'd love to hear from you. As always, if you did enjoy the video, please do consider subscribing to Nintendrew for all sorts of cool gaming content, and make sure to share it with any friends who might find it interesting. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Bye!